morning, friends. Welcome to JW3. Welcome back to JW3, those of you that we haven't seen for a while. And if this is your first visit, thank you for joining us this morning for our annual Holocaust Memorial Day ceremony. I'm Raymond Simonson. I'm very proud to be the Chief Executive Officer of JW3. Could I ask you, please, just a couple of housekeeping notes? As this is a ceremony, not a show, I'm going to ask if you would please turn your phones onto silent or turn them off. Please don't have any flash if you're taking a photo, which is fine if you want to take any photos, but please just turn the flash off. And please, even though the contributions you'll hear will be beautiful and moving, we ask you to please refrain from clapping. We'll keep the applause for when we have wonderful shows. Today is a more solemn ceremony, so if we can ask you to do that, that will be wonderful. I'm going to just introduce you and hand over to our narrator, Ben Kaplan, and we're delighted that Ben is with us today. He is an actor, a director. He's performed on stage, theatre, television, and award-winning films. You probably know him from work including Winter's Tale, The End of Night, Dr. Korczak's Example, Call the Midwife, Band of Brothers, to name just a few. So I'm just going to hand over to Ben Kaplan for this morning's ceremony. Thank you, Ben.
Holocaust Memorial Day is an international commemoration day dedicated to the remembrance of the 6 million Jews and others who suffered in the Holocaust under Nazi persecution. Since 2001, Britain has been marking this important day of reflection, a day of learning from the past for a better future. The day chosen is the 27th of January, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the camp at the center of the attempt to annihilate European Jewry. Auschwitz is just a part of the genocidal fabric that makes up the Holocaust. In addition to Auschwitz, there were other death camps, mobile killing units, concentration camps, labor camps, and transit camps operating with the help of people just doing their jobs. As well as Jews, other groups were persecuted for their perceived racial and biological inferiority. These included Roma, disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war, and homosexuals. Others, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, socialists, and communists, were targeted for their religious or political beliefs. The totality, geographic, and human scale of the Holocaust makes it difficult to comprehend. By looking at the Holocaust through the prism of this year's theme of ordinary people, we can bring it back to a human level. Not all the victims were saints or rebels. For every hero or rebel, there were countless ordinary men and women who simply did what seemed to be their best choice at the time. We can also ponder about how the seemingly insignificant actions of people helped perpetrate this atrocity and realize that every individual action has consequences. During this commemoration, we will meet and learn from survivors Marla Tribic, Jackie Young, Eve Kugler, rescuer Sally Noach, and former Kindertransport refugees Elsa Shamash, Bernd Koshland, and Anne and Bob Kirk, whose stories and recollections will form a thread throughout. We will hear the voices of the present generation, voices that will inspire us with hope and the knowledge that anti-Semitism, racism, and other social injustices will be challenged and questioned. The simple but terrible truth is that the Holocaust was experienced and carried out by human beings, ordinary people. This is crucial in understanding not only the Holocaust, but also the genocides that have occurred throughout history, and especially those since 1945 in Cambodia, Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. As we speak, there are people all over the world suffering discrimination, persecution, and genocide. We invite Hazan Johnny Turgle to the stage to sing Shema Yisrael by Sarit Haddad. He is accompanied by the Kramer and Durkin duo.
חיי, נתת לי הכל. בעיניי דמעה, הלב בוכה בשקט, וכשהלב שותק, הנשמה זועקת. שמע ישראל אלוקיי, אתה כל יכול. נתת לי את חיי, נתת לי הכל. בעיניי דמעה, הלב בוכה בשקט, וכשהלב שותק, הנשמה זועקת. כשהלב בוכה, הזמן עומד מלכת. האדם רואה את כל חייו פתאום אל הלא נודע, הוא לא רוצה ללכת. לאלוקיו קורא על סף תהום. שמע ישראל אלוקיי, אתה כל יכול. נתת לי את חיי, נתת לי הכל. בעיניי דמעה, הלב בוכה בשקט, וכשהלב שותק, הנשמה זועקת. שמע ישראל אלוקיי, עכשיו אני לבד. חזק אותי אלוקיי, עשה שלא אפחד. הכאב גדול ואין לאן לברוח. עשה שיגמר, כי לא נותר בי כוח.
Before the Nazis and their collaborators dominated the continent, there were vibrant Jewish communities all over Europe. Jews could be found in all walks of life as farmers, tailors, seamstresses, factory hands, accountants, doctors, teachers, and small business owners. Some families were wealthy, many more were poor. By 1945, these communities were destroyed and annihilated. Houses, buildings, and synagogues where once people lived and congregated now stood empty and cold, a stark and painful reminder of what was lost. Marla Tribich was born in Piotrków Trybunalski in Poland and remembers a pleasant life before the war with her parents, older brother Ben and younger sister Lucia. Marla has memories of close family bonds, friendships, and of being loved and cared for. Sally Noach was born in 1911 into a hard-working Jewish family in Zutphen, Holland. His father was a traveling salesman, and Sally followed in his footsteps, living in Belgium and France, enjoying a bachelor's life. Elsa, Anne, Bob, Bernd, and Eve were born into established families who had contributed to German society for many generations. With the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany and the Nazi expansion in Europe, they all became potential victims and their lives were forever changed. As soon as the Nazi Party assumed leadership in Germany in 1933, the quest to oust German Jews from every aspect of German society started. By the outbreak of war in 1939, over 400 decrees had been enforced. The Nuremberg laws in 1935 saw German Jews lose their citizenship and set out who was a Jew according to the Nazi racial ideology. Hundreds of individuals, ordinary people in all levels of government throughout the country were involved in the persecution of Jews as they conceived, discussed, drafted, adopted, enforced, and supported anti-Jewish legislation that restricted all aspects of public and private lives. No corner of Germany was left untouched. Panic intensified in 1938 as the Anschluss with Austria and Kristallnacht in November saw a wave of anti-Semitic violence across countries under Nazi rule. Elsa, Anne, Bob, and Eve recount what it was like to live in Germany during this uncertain time and how their families reacted to what was happening. In each of their testimonies are examples of ordinary people and their actions and choices and the effect it had, positive and negative.
Born in Berlin, and everything was sort of fine, but Germany was pretty much in turmoil already.
And I loved our time in Cologne. We had a boat, which we took out every weekend on the Rhine.
I was the baby of the family. Dad had served in the First World War, got a couple of decorations. He saw himself as a good patriotic German who happened to be Jewish.
In 1936, when my brother was supposed to go to secondary school, and the headmaster said, "We will accept your son, but we cannot protect him. If the teachers or the children bully him, there is nothing I can do."
The program was to eject Jews from the social, the commercial, the economic, and the political life of the country, and get rid of them.
I remember the typewriter going constantly, applications to emigrate for the parents and me.
10 days before Kristallnacht, on October 29th, two Nazis came to the store and they arrested my grandfather. Then he was deported to Poland and we never saw him again. And 10 days later, in the middle of the night, pounding on the door, and it was the local police chief, because we lived across the street from the local police station, so he knew us well and we knew him. Came through the apartment and they started creating general havoc and destruction.
The 9th of November, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, there was a telephone call. Somebody was warning him. He just got up, packed a tiny case and said goodbye. And for 3 days, we had no idea where my father was.
Until the morning when we woke up, and there were the Jewish men sweeping up the glass. And I was frightened.
I was met at the gate by one of the few teachers who was usually sympathetic. So he proceeded to enlighten me. The synagogue had been burnt down. There'd been a lot of arrests. You had better go home and don't even think of coming back to this school.
And so my mom put on some decent clothes and marched across the street to the local police station and asked, "Where's my husband?" She was told that he was in the concentration camp of Buchenwald, and that if she wanted to get him out of Buchenwald, she had to produce a visa so that he could leave the country, because we don't want Jews in Germany. We don't want Jews in Germany. The refrain that we had been hearing for a number of years.
So I was sent out with errands. And I came back from one of these to find my dad just coming down the road starting to look for me. And having been told off for being late, he said, "Well, next week you're off on the Kindertransport." So I was the last to go, which must have been absolutely terrible for both my parents.
Now I well remember the last train journey was saying goodbye at the station and being told to look out of the window at the next station but one. They must have taken a taxi to the next station but one, and there they were on the platform, waving to me, the last wave. And that is my last image of them, running along the platform, waving.
It became clear that there was no future for Jews in Nazi-occupied territory. Sadly, There were not many countries who opened their borders to desperate Jewish refugees. Kristallnacht convinced the British government to at least allow children into Britain, as long as guarantors and sponsors could be found to ensure they were not a financial burden. Jewish and non-Jewish organizations, including the Quakers, worked together to find homes, hostels, and schools for the children, relying on the help of ordinary people who were willing to open their home for a stranger in need. Around 10,000 German, Austrian, and Czech Jewish and non-Aryan children came to Britain. Bernd Koschland explains how many people were involved in ensuring he was cared for.
I came to England when I was just turned 8 on the Kindertransport. I arrived in Southampton, from where I was taken into a hostel in Margate. Stayed there for a while when war was declared. The school was evacuated to a little village in Staffordshire called Hammeridge. Stayed there with a non-Jewish family for about a year and a bit. They'd never seen Jewish people, the family we lived with. We were sent matzot and I think a little packet of margarine, if I remember right. That was my provision for Passover. I went to the hostel in Tyler's Green, run by an Orthodox community. Life was quite happy there, but I then went on to the Royal Grammar School, which gave me a very, very good education, for which I was very, very thankful. Committee of the hostel, particularly the secretary, Sissy Rosenfelder, she was very, very good. She was like an advisor in many ways and helpful, not just to me, but to other children, youngsters as well. In 1948, I went to stay with my former kindergarten teacher from home, from Fürth, where I came from. And I stayed with her and her husband. They had no children, so I was like a son of the family. And that helped me an awful lot. So.
By 1940, most of Europe was under the control of Germany and its collaborators. The aggressive anti-Jewish laws had taken its toll on the Jewish population. Ghettos were established, forcing people to live under horrendous conditions. Ghettos were small areas in the center of town that were cordoned off. Jews were herded in and not allowed out. Thousands died of starvation and disease. Some Jews went into hiding, and Jews organized themselves in fighting back. Relatively few people helped Jews escape. Those who did aid Jews were motivated by opposition to Nazi racism, by compassion, or by religious or moral principle. In a few rare instances, entire communities, as well as individuals, helped save Jews. They did so at tremendous risk. In many places, providing shelter to Jews was punishable by death. Possibilities for escape or rescue were becoming more limited, often reliant on the moral courage of consular officials and diplomats issuing visas, in most cases fabricated, often defying orders. In a bureaucratic killing machine, papers meant life, as Yves Kugler experienced while in France.
My mother managed to get a second forged visa. My mother then had to sign over all of my father's assets to the Nazis. Considerable amount of investment savings, the business, etc., etc. And we then arrived in France at the end of June 1939, 2 months before the war broke out, at which point my father was arrested as a German national. And shortly after that, my sisters and I went into a home for Jewish children, an Ose home, if anybody's heard about that. We were in the Ose home. We were bombed, but missed as the Nazis were approaching Paris, because we were on the route. We were evacuated to central France, lived under Vichy occupation main consequence being extremely hungry. There was no food. And eventually there was a visa from the Americans, a very limited visa for children in French concentration camps, because there were camps in France and there were children in it. And the French resistance was unable to get the children out of the camp. So they gave the visas to the Osé. We were the last people to go because my mom had secured a job as a cook in the home. My mother did whatever. She was very remarkable. And my dad had been released from having been arrested when Paris fell, and made his way to the home. So because my parents were there, we were the last people to have gone to America. But then, shortly before the chosen children were ready to go, and they're mostly orphans or whereabouts of parents unknown, two of the children got sick, lost their health clearance, and now they have the two visas and no time, and my parents were there to sign everything. So that's how my sister Ruth and I got to America. So if you've ever heard of survivor's guilt, I had it in spades because it was very specific that I went and took somebody else's place.
Sally Noach, a Dutch carpet seller, had ended up in Lyon, France, and worked as a volunteer at what was left of Dutch official representation. His daughter, Lady Irene Hatter, tells his story, which will be followed by music, Nigun, composed by Ernest Bloch and performed by the Kramer and Durkin duo.
This is the story of my Dutch Jewish father, Sally Noach, who in World War II was not a guts and glory hero on the battlefield, but a fighter in dangerously occupied France. His bravery was the so-called ordinary man's choice in a moral dilemma, putting his own life at risk to save others. The award-winning documentary about his wartime activities shows you a previously untold narrative of an extraordinary man in the highlights of the Nazi oppression. Why was it hidden for so many years? It was put together from archives and documents in Sally's memoir, and vividly from letters and photos which came from stowed away suitcases of families and their offsprings, whose lives he had saved. As my brother and I learned, it had not been for your father, we would have not been here today. After the war, there was a reluctance to talk about the horrors, and we, his children, were discouraged from asking. There are also disturbing undercurrents of anti-Semitism in Dutch politics, which Sally bitterly took to heart and which made him an unpopular in exiled government circles. He identified the negative attitude of officials towards refugee Jews, many of them young engineers, doctors, officers trying to get to England to contribute to the war effort. He was accused of acting illegally and flaunting, but my dad was never one to follow rules. A rebel from school days, he became a successful carpet merchant, living by his wits and his talent for persuasion. He escaped from invaded Belgium for the last train to reach unoccupied France. With no diplomatic credentials, himself involved with the Dutch consul in Lyon, Maurice Jacquet, and operated through a network of resistance and friendly local police to get refugees out of forged papers crossing the border to Switzerland and Spain. Compared to Raoul Wallenberg, this was not how it was. Sully had no backing from powerful family nor a Red Cross like the great Swedish diplomat. He was his own invention by sheer chutzpah and commitment of refugees, both Jewish and others. He was always at personal risk. He could have been snatched from the street, imprisoned, or worse. However, he had an incredible belief that what he had to do. So in 1942, when the Nazi oppression was getting more savage, and 2,300 people were rounded up and imprisoned, Sally went to jail, demanded to see the guard, and invented names and forged documents to get his people out, saving 430 from deportation. There had been no intervention from the Dutch authorities. It was only Sally's force of personality and contempt for rules which he had cheated for the Nazis. As the butcher of Lyon, Klaus Barbie, was approaching, Sally knew he had to flee, and he got to England in December 1942, to the Dutch government in exile. Passed with flying colours by the spy catcher Aristo Pinto in London, others were far less welcoming to Sally, who reported on the double standards of the Dutch doing nothing to help Jewish refugees and by implication showing complicity with the Nazis. The only sympathetic ear he had was from the Queen Wilhelmina, herself in exile, and many years later Sally had recognition from the Dutch royal family. Sally was his own fearless in action and his opinions. He chose to do what he thought was right, but there was no self-congratulation. He was deeply affected by his wartime experience, and perhaps at the heart of his story is Sally's tragic knowledge that he could not save his own parents, who were murdered in Auschwitz. His choices were heroic for many, but it has there any lessons for us and any future generation. In life, there are no easy choices.
On the 20th of January 1942, 15 Nazi officials met at a villa in the exclusive Berlin suburb of Wannsee. For a couple of hours, these men calmly discussed how to carry out the murders of 11 million people across Europe, whom the regime identified as Jews. The consequences of this meeting were quickly felt across Europe. Jewish persecution had changed from isolation and exclusion to exploitation and murder on an industrial scale. As a result of the January discussion, a network of extermination camps was established using the most efficient methods to murder between 1.7 million people between 1942 and 1943 alone. We must remember that behind all these events and processes were functionaries in offices, stations, signal boxes, and telephone exchanges across Europe, people doing ordinary jobs, typed lists, ensured platforms and tracks were clear, and relayed messages and orders. The drivers of the trains that were propelled by this bureaucratic army must have heard the cries of the deported, smelt the effects of hunger and poor hygiene, but they were ordinary people doing ordinary jobs. Let's hear from Marla Tribic as she explains how this paper pushing translated into reality.
Well, my story starts in Piotrków in Poland, and we were the first ghetto to be created in Europe. It started almost at the beginning of the war. By 1939, by November 1939, we had already been incarcerated behind ghetto walls. Now, I won't go on about the ghetto, but after about 2.5 years, rumors started circulating that there's going to be a deportation, and we knew that it was going to be to places like Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, and we knew that no one ever came out alive from there. And there was real panic. So people tried to save themselves in some way if they could. One of the ways was to go outside, smuggle oneself outside and hide in sewers, in forests, anywhere out of sight. And some people had friends outside who would maybe save 1 or 2 members of the family. And some people were doing it actually for money. And my father, together with my uncle Joseph Klein, were introduced to a man in another town, Częstochowa, which was sort of on the German border. And this man was actually of German origin. He was prepared to hide 2 Jewish girls, and that was for money. That was a business arrangement. And he came to meet my father and uncle, and he agreed to do it. He was paid in advance. He said that he will go home, come back next week for me, and the week after for my cousin Ija. And that in itself was very, very worrying, because we didn't know when the deportation was starting. And but it all happened. We went by train to Częstochowa, and we found ourselves in a house on the outskirts with a middle-aged couple. But the man was actually their son-in-law. He lived around the corner with his wife and child, and we weren't exactly welcome, but we were tolerated, we weren't ill-treated, but we were in great danger of possibly being discovered, and we were supposed to be relatives from Warsaw. And when there was a knock on the door, sometimes it was okay for us to mix, and other times we were just hidden in a cupboard under the bed, anywhere out of sight. And we were very homesick, very vulnerable. And my cousin Ija, who was an only child, and incidentally I was one of 3 children, the middle one, with an older brother Ben and a younger sister Lucia. And we were, well, these Ija, who was, as I say, was an only child, she was so scared, so homesick, she couldn't bear it, asked to be taken home. And the man said, you can't go home yet because the deportations are still happening. And she said that her parents have very good friends in Piotrków. They're hiding their valuables, they'll take her in. And he said, okay. She went back, and I was still languishing there what seemed like a lifetime. But eventually, my time came to go home, and we were to meet my father in a flour mill, which before the war was, it belonged to him in partnership with his brother and another man. Now he was lucky to have a job there. And when we entered, there was my father waiting for me, but also my uncle, Joseph Klein. He looked at us and he went white. He was so shocked. He said, "Where's my child?" And this man said, "Well, I brought her back. I took her to you, very good friends. I won't say the name." And he said, "But she's not there. Where is she? What have you done with my child?" And I still remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground, pacing there and back, saying, "What have you done with my child?" And this is the end of the story, because Ija has never been seen again, and nobody knows what happened to her. Soon after that, my uncle and my father, there were 2 Helfgott brothers and 2 Klein brothers, they were all arrested, and lots of other people. They were imprisoned for some time, and then some were released. My father and 1 Klein uncle was released, not Ija's father. And the rest were taken to the cemetery, lined up against the wall and shot. And so my aunt lost her daughter and her husband in a very short space of time. She survived the war. And we used to meet, and she remained being a very lovely aunt to me, and I could never understand it, what she must have felt about her own child. But we didn't talk about it often, just occasionally, and it was too painful, and neither of us knew what happened. But I won't repeat all the things over the years that she said, but just one, the sort of pain she lived with. And that was that once she said to me, my Ija had to go into the gas chamber by herself. There was nobody to hold her hand. And that was just one thing that I repeated to you. So at that time, when I was handed over to my father, went back into the ghetto with him, and all that was very, I'm leaving out all the really important details, but there isn't the time to tell the story really. We went back into the ghetto, and normally they were always counting and looking at papers, but at that time they just turned a blind eye, but they had their agenda. When everybody that was returning was back, then they started rounding them up. And on one occasion, when I got back, my family was intact because my brother had a work permit. My father, mother, and sister were living with Polish families, 3 different families. And that was very unusual because there were very few people left. Out of 24,000, there were now 2,000 people left and they all had jobs, then they were going to be transferred to factories outside. But they knew that there were a lot of illegals, as they put it, people, and they started searching for them. On one day they rounded up they stormed into a room where I was with a lot of people. We were all illegal, so to speak. And they were all taken. I was left behind because I wasn't bad. And my mother said I wasn't well. And it's very unusual was for someone to say, for a policeman in charge to say, well, that's all right, she can stay, but that's what he did. And as my mother was going out with my sister and all the other people, my mother said to me, don't go anywhere, just stay here till your father comes home from work. And they were taken to the cemetery, well, they were taken to the synagogue, where they were kept under terrible conditions, and soon after that they were taken to the local forest and killed in the most shocking way. I really have to keep, well, I wouldn't tell you the details. I didn't witness it, but I know exactly what happened. And there are a lot of books about it, and it was happening all over Europe. So there were 3 of us left, but then my aunt, or the Helfgott aunt, was rounded up, and then she was taken away screaming, who would look after my child. She had an only little daughter of 5. And I was the only Helfgott member of the family left, so it was down to me. After that, the ghetto was liquidated. We were transferred to labor camps. And after about 1.5 years, we were marched to the railway station, men separately from women. And we were deported. We didn't know where we were going. But I can tell you now that the men were deported to Buchenwald and the women to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Now, in Ravensbrück, the first thing they did when we arrived was to take everything away from us. It wasn't much. Then we had to queue up and give our details because they're meticulous, as you know, in record keeping. Then we had to undress. Our clothing was taken away. Our heads were shaved. We went through cold communal showers. And when we came out at the other end, we were given the concentration camp garb. And when we looked at one another, we seriously couldn't recognize each other. We were just a lot of shaved heads and stripes. And it was such a shock to our system. It's difficult to describe what it does to you when you're stripped of your personality, your looks, you just like an object. And one of the things it does is to make you lose hope. And without hope, there is no survival. Soon after that, my aunt, Franja Klein, died. After that, my friend Pema Blachman died. And I'm mentioning their name because I think it's so important. The 6 million have become just 6 million. I can't imagine what 6 million people look like the size of it. It's so enormous. And these people, I mean, some of them, we don't know their names. And so I have made the point that if I know anybody's name who perished in the Shoah, I always mention it. Well, we were in Ravensbrück, and again, I won't go into details. We weren't there very long when we were put on cattle trucks again, and after a shorter journey, because the first one was 4.5 hours under terrible conditions. Now we were moving off to when we arrived, turned out to be Bergen-Belsen. And, well, I don't intend to tell you much about Bergen-Belsen because I know that you must have all seen films and read books, because Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the British Army. And so when there's lots I'm leaving out, obviously I can't tell you the whole story. But we were very lucky. I heard that there was children's home somewhere in the camp. I quickly set out to find it with my little cousin. And luckily they took us. And I mean, they interviewed us, asked a lot of questions. And in the end, one of them said to me, she said, well, we are also very overcrowded, but in any case, you are too old. I was then 14. And I said, okay, will you take my cousin? And they said, oh yes, we're going to take her anyway. I was 14 and she was 7, and she was very small and frail. And there was no way Anne was going to stay without me. She was so terrified of losing me all the way through, and she wasn't going to give me up that easily. And anyway, they realized that, and they actually took us both in. And that was a real stroke of luck. And even there, I caught typhus. And I remember lying on my upper bunk by the window, must have come back into consciousness. And I saw people running, and I thought, I didn't know where they were running or why, but the only thing that came to mind was, how have they got the strength to run? Because typhus is such a debilitating condition. You just can't move a muscle. And that was the 15th of April, 1945, when we were liberated by the British Army. So there's so many more details, but obviously I don't have the time, do I? But may I tell you just a tiny story that happened this morning? I had to get here from Paddington by taxi. I was in the taxi, and I never used to talk. Whenever I had taxi, I used to say, so where are you going, and why are you going there, and what you're doing at the school, if I ever went to speak to schools. And I was always reluctant I just didn't want to talk about it to people. I could talk to a big audience, but not to individuals. But over the years, I think I sort of got used to the idea that people do ask sometimes. So this morning, this man said to me, oh, so where are you going, what you doing? And I very easily offered this information that today is Holocaust Memorial Day. And he said, yes, I have heard it on the radio. And that, of course, pleased me. People actually do know about it now. So, and then he said, so you're going there? I said, yes. I don't know if I told him that I'm speaking, but we just talked a little bit about the Holocaust. And then he became very interested, and he was absolutely shocked that anything like that could have happened. But when I got out of the taxi and going to pay him, he said, I'm not going to charge you. And he said, that's the least little thing I can do towards, the expenses at least. And I sort of felt it's worth repeating that there are really lovely people out there, and they're interested, and they're getting to know about it slowly. So I'm thinking maybe there is some hope that this won't happen again. So thank you very much for listening.
Liberation was not a sweet victory. As the camps were freed, the atrocities that had taken place became clear. The realization of the sheer number of people that had been killed, organized by a civilized society, facilitated by ordinary people, was hard to fathom. Life returned from the ashes. Survivors with nowhere to go lingered in displaced persons camps, Marriages were made, babies were born. Where to go, however, remained a difficult question. Home no longer existed for many. It was common for individuals to be the only survivors of their family, let alone their whole community. For many, when they did return, it was to be chased away or worse. Mostly, though, it was the emptiness that drove survivors from thoughts of return. Please listen to Johnny Turgle singing Empty Chairs and Empty Tables.
There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on. Empty chairs at empty tables. Now my friends are dead and gone. Here they talked of revolution. Here it was they lit the flame. Here they sang about tomorrow, and tomorrow never came. From the table in the corner, they could see a world reborn, and they rose with voices ringing, and I can hear them now, the very words that they had sung became their last communion on this lonely barricade at dawn. Oh, my friends, forgive me that I live and you are gone. There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on. Phantom faces at the windows, phantom shadows on the floor, empty chairs at empty tables where my friends will meet no more. Oh, my friends, don't ask me what your sacrifice was for. Empty chairs at empty tables where my friends will sing no more.
While many survivors seem strong, composed, and resilient, the scars often remain and are most painful out of sight. Some of the ever smaller number of survivors still relive the past as they retell it. The ripples of grief still resonate. The second and third generation have had to live with the presence of the absence of relatives and the silence. Many choose to continue to tell their family history and go out into the educational community to bear witness. Jackie Young has had to grapple most of his adult life dealing with the absence of memories, but with the presence of trauma. Listen to his story of discovering his past.
Okay. I was born in 1941, adopted when I was 9 years old. My adopted parents doted on me but were not very forthcoming with the information about my beginnings. It wasn't until I got married that I finally got to hold the birth certificate, and information on it rocked me to my core. I was not a Blitz baby, as I thought I was. As a baby, I'd been in a concentration camp of Terezin from 1942 until liberation. I was in fact born in Vienna, Austria, to Elsa Spiegel. My name was not Jackie, but Yona. I was part of a group of what is now known as the Boys, who were brought over to England after the war. We were together in Windermere, and later I and other survivors were taken to Bulldogs Bank under the care of Anna Freud and the sisters Sophie and Gertrude Dan. Bulldogs Bank was a house given to us by a wonderful person called Lady Clark, who lived nearby. I was there for 1 year with 5 other children. From there, we were sent to another place called Weir Courtney, which is where a few miles away, that was where I was fostered by the people who finally adopted me. But I remember nothing. I have no memories of the time in Terezin, no memories of the time directly after the war in Windermere, Bulldogs Bank and Weir Courtney. In fact, I don't have any vivid memories of prior to my age of 9. My wonderful wife, who thought she was marrying an uncomplicated man, was suddenly faced with a husband who had to come to terms with the knowledge that he was a child survivor of the Holocaust. My wife stood by me, helped me, guided me, and has gone to the difficult journey of self-discovery with me. Ever since I found out my real identity, I've been searching for more information. I've been able to trace my mother's last journey to Malé-Trostinet, where she was murdered. I have engrossed myself with learning German, exploring Vienna, and I've been to dedications to memories to Jewish victims in Austria and Belarus to honor and speak to my mother's name. It has taken me over 60 years to find out about my roots. Not knowing where you come from, no family stories, not knowing the names of your relatives, not being able to properly commemorate has been very difficult to bear. I've been speculating that my origins, I was once spared. Why was I spared, and why 1.5 million children not? I am the sole survivor. Are there any other relatives out there? All these questions and more kept whirling around my head for all these years. My search has now come to an end. Thanks to the advances in DNA research, I have finally managed to find descendants of my paternal line. I cannot tell you how life-changing this has been for me, knowing that I am no longer alone. I now know who my parents were, and I can finally utter the name and remember the honor of them. My father's name was Adolf Kornfein. He was born in 1894 and was a tailor. Adolf and Elsa lived within a short distance of one another. Records show that on June the 2nd in 1942, Adolf and Elsa were both deported to Malé-Trostinet. It is with the help of ordinary people and their choices that I am here where I am today. My mother, who left me out of love and desperation. The Gestapo, who took me out of the orphanage and deported me and others to Terezin. Prisoners in Terezin who must have looked after me and protected me. Young soldiers and who brought me over to England. People who gave up their houses to nurture Holocaust orphans back to life. Women like the sisters Dans who taught us to be children. My adopted parents who indulged and loved me but could not bring themselves to tell me the truth. The DNA researchers who helped her worked hard to discover my family. My wife, who had to pick me up each time I had a setback in my search. And the loving family, old and new, have been by my side ever since. I came across as a happy-go-lucky man with a cheeky personality. People do not expect me, an ordinary Londoner, to have such an ordinary past. In the words of the poet and writer Maya Angelou, in every conceivable manner, the family in the link is to our past, the bridge to our future. Family is everything. And I have my cousin. Thank you.
There is provision to teach and learn from the Holocaust, but despite all the good work out in the community, we are still faced with a rise in anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. The need to reach out to ordinary people, to the people of the future, and ensure a truthful message about the Holocaust is taught is more important than ever. Thankfully, the next generations are active, interested, and inspiring. As we commemorate, we must look ahead and understand the struggles, but also understand there are people working towards a better tomorrow. Please watch and listen to Maisie Barnett, who took part in the Bat Mitzvah Twinning Project organised by Yad Vashem UK, and Mihikra Chopra, an ambassador from the Holocaust Educational Trust. Their short film will be followed by the Mayor of Camden, Councillor Nassim Ali, who will share his thoughts. Then we will light candles in remembrance of the 6 million, followed by a minute's silence. After the minute's silence, Hazan Johnny Turgle, grandson of the survivors Gina Turgle and Sam Gardner, will sing El Male Rachamim, for which we ask people to be standing.
My name is Maisie Barnett. I am 16 now, but when I was 12 and 13, I took part in the Bat Mitzvah Twinning programme organised by Yad Vashem UK. I was twinned with Mary de Jong, a 9-year-old Dutch victim of the Holocaust who was murdered in Sobibor. When I started my research into her short life, me and my mother managed to track down Mary's best friend, Renate Beek. She invited us on a tour around Amsterdam to take us around where her and Mary grew up. I decided to record and film our journey into the footsteps of Mary, and it was one of the most moving, difficult, and unforgettable experiences of my life so far. We knocked on the door of Mary's old flat and we were allowed to come in. When I stood in her bedroom, the enormity of it all hit me. We now know that they were taken to Westerbork, where they stayed for a few weeks before being deported to Sobibor. I visited Westerbork. The place was eerily quiet and still, and the air felt heavy with sadness. The film I made was shortlisted for a prize in the Netherlands, and Renate came to my bat mitzvah. She gave me the childhood book that once belonged to Mary, with the plea to make sure their story is still passed on. Learning about Mary has made me realise we need to call out any signs of racism or any signs of anti-Semitism. Education is crucial. I encourage everyone to use the resources available. There is so much out there. Educational Trust, HMDT, Yad Vashem UK. They all produce and organise high quality and thought-provoking stuff. Listening to eyewitnesses whilst we still can is a must. I'm aware that the number of survivors are becoming less and less. I've had the privilege to meet Marla Tribick, Anne and Bob Kirk, Ziggy Shipper, Joseph Pell, Solly Irving and Leon Greenman. Their stories I will pass on as the witness. I believe that the power of individuals, of ordinary people, can be harnessed for good. Look at me, a then 13-year-old girl. I met Renata, who passed on her knowledge to me. My film has now been seen by hundreds of people. I generated interest in this subject, and that is just me. If we all put in a little bit of effort, question more, show interest in our history, we can learn and grow.
Hello, my name is Mihika Chopra, and I'm an ambassador for the Holocaust Educational Trust. I'm from Bracknell, and I'm currently reading law at the University of Southampton. I took part in the Trust's Lessons from Auschwitz online project in 2021. During this project, I was very privileged to be able to hear the testimony of Janine Weber. Hers was the first testimony that I'd ever heard, and it's something that will truly stick with me for the rest of my life. I can never forget it. I was subsequently able to visit Auschwitz-Birkenau and the town of Oświęcim when taking part in the Trust's Lessons from Auschwitz Universities project, just this past October. This is an experience I still struggle to articulate. I was, however, struck by an exhibit created by Yad Vashem, located in Block 27, Auschwitz I, which envelops visitors in sound, audio, clips, ultimately memories of survivors and victims of the Holocaust alike. It really touched my heart because the happiness and love shared between individuals, families, and communities, the fact that I knew that this was destroyed by blatant hatred and anti-Semitism was and remains to be truly saddening. This year's theme for Holocaust Memorial Day is Ordinary People. This is vital to Holocaust remembrance and education because although we are all individuals with distinct experiences and lives, in the words of Janine Weber BEM, despite these differences, it is our humanity which binds us together. It was ordinary people who perpetrated the Holocaust, but it was also ordinary people who survived the Holocaust, and this is ultimately testament to not only the destruction that humanity is capable of, but also a testament to the strength of human spirit, which is the message that I think we should all be taking away from this. Therefore, to myself and other young people across Britain today, this is why it is vital to not only remember history, but to also learn from it, as I was told by Harry Spiro BEM. This is not only to continue ensuring that we honour survivors like Harry, but to also ensure that we continue to work towards a world in which genocide and the Holocaust remain relics of the past, never to be repeated again. Therefore, I would like to ask all young people watching today, what will you do to ensure that humanity has learned the lessons that have been taught to us by the Holocaust?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Councillor Nassim Ali, Mayor of Camden. I did have a written speech, but I've been going to so many of these Holocaust Memorial Day events, and the speech that I write keeps changing because of the life stories I hear and the experiences of people. And I've heard Elsa so often, and Elsa's become like a family member to me now in terms of my own sort of personal experience of coming here as an immigrant, in terms of how you leave everything behind in another country and you come here. And then the love that you get from people who you hadn't known before. And I think the theme of ordinary people is so strong, because it's ordinary people that give you a free taxi ride, but it's also ordinary people that can kill millions of people as well. And for me, as an ex-youth worker, I took 90 young people to Auschwitz and Krakow back in 1998, just to experience and see what happened. And it was traumatic for us. We were in tears as youth workers, the young people were in tears. But obviously you overcome that, and then you just seeing the hair, seeing the children's shoes, seeing the women's hair, seeing shoes, seeing suitcases, and the ashes. And there were questions for me, is like, why? How? How did the Polish people stand aside and not do anything? Because there was like people living by it. But obviously maybe they were too scared as well. They're ordinary people. The Gestapo, Hitler, were ordinary people. But I think
the sadness is it still goes on now. You know, there's a lot of genocide happening now, and we're still not learning. So it's good that that message keeps going forward, keeps coming forward, and we never forget. So every event I go to for Holocaust Memorial Day, I learn something new. And for us, as politicians, as councillors, as mayor, and Tulip Siddiqui is here as our MP, and also Keir Starmer, our other Camden MP, I know that they are strong supporters and they are people with integrity that want action and take effective action. But I think there are a lot of other powerful people in the world who may just sit silently and not act. And that's something that, if there's something I say to everyone to take away from this, is make sure that you don't stand in silence and just watch when something happens. You act. We are stronger together than if we're alone. And the message from all of us must be, you know, love will always overcome hatred. And in Camden, we've got a lot of, what I say when I go around everywhere is like, most places or everywhere, people are happy to see me, and I say, I share the love in Camden. And I think that's what we must all be doing, is like, you know, in terms of if we see hatred, if we see racism, tackle it head on. And it's not always easy. It's not always easy, but wherever we can, tackle it. And like, you know, I've heard so many amazing people talk today, and like, you know, my heart went out to every single one of you. And I want to clap. I felt like giving you a hug, and I will later, you know, because I think it's that compassion that we need to show as human beings. And it is that we need to, irrespective of whatever religion you're from, you believe in, or none, whatever color you are. And that's the beauty, I think, of Camden. You know, I don't feel like a foreigner in Camden anymore. I feel like it's my country, it's my borough. I don't always feel welcome in this country, but I feel in Camden I feel welcome. I feel a strong identity. I feel like we have what we call our rich tulip, a rich social mix. And in Camden, you know, I think it's very strong. And if we can keep growing that across other places across the world, then we will come a long way. And like, you know, I'm sure that as we go along, we've heard stories of the young people, of how they're learning. And I've heard, I think, one of the speakers at City Hall, I think it was on Monday with Sadiq Khan. And it's good to just keep passing that message of ordinary people. So it's really an honor to be here with you today. And I will now invite the survivors, Marla Tribic, Jackie Young, Joan Salter, Irene Hatter, Elsa Shamash, and Gabby Glassman to light these candles. Where are the candles? To light these candles to remember the 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust, including 1.5 million children, alongside the millions of people killed under Nazi persecution of other groups. Once they have lit the candle, we will commence a 1-minute silence in remembrance of all these people, in hope, in faith, and in compassion.
שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה, על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. לנשמות ששת מיליוני אחינו בני ישראל, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנהרגו ושנשחטו, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנקברו חיים על קידוש השם. באושוויץ, מיידנק, טרבלינקה, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, ובשאר מחנות השמדה, בעבור כולנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמתם. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם מסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם. בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו ושלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן.
The final words are for Elsa, Bernd, Eve, Anne, and Bob. Their experience and wisdom will strengthen and inspire us all. This will conclude our ceremony.
There's still a lot of racial intolerance, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and it is so wrong.
To be absolutely topical, I think the way immigrants are being treated now is terrible. When people talk about illegal immigrants, there's no such thing. Nobody leaves home unless they have to. If life is so bad that they leave without knowing where they're going, that doesn't make them illegal migrants. Makes them people who need support.
Whatever we do, that we follow the concept in the book of Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. The neighbor being not just your next door neighbor, but neighbor in a sort of wider sense.
As soon as you start identifying somebody as being different and talking up the idea that these different people are a danger to you, a danger to your community, a danger to your nation, you're on a slippery slope.
I credit both of my parents. They're good and very ordinary, average people who rose to the most amazing heights when it was necessary.
Of course I miss parents. You miss them all the way along. The thing has happened. I can't undo it. I've got to live with it. I've got to look to the full future.
And they would not have wanted me to be unhappy, what with meeting Bob and now having our family and now the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren.
The abiding result of the Holocaust, to me, it was the loss and separation of family, constant loss and insecurity, this loss of family.
A day like Holocaust Memorial Day and its commemoration is important to tell people this is the message. Go out into the world, talk about what has happened, and by showing what has happened, hopefully lessons may be learned.
And we have to remember the Holocaust. We have to spread information about the Holocaust, educate people against anti-Semitism and a repetition.
Friends, it just remains for me to thank all of our contributors, whether you spoke, sung, played, whether you were on screen or here on the stage or lit candles. Thank you to all of you. Thank you particularly to Tamar, with support from Judy, for putting together a beautiful and moving Holocaust Memorial Day ceremony. I'd like to thank all of you that joined us, whether you're in the room or the 200 or so people watching online. Thank you so much. Particularly joining us today, I wanted to thank our local MP Tulip, the Mayor of Camden, the students of South Hampstead High School who come every year and join us. It's always wonderful to have you back. But most of all, I'd like to thank those survivors that are here with us in the room today. It is always a privilege for everyone at JW3, the staff and volunteers, to have you with us, whatever the occasion. Whether you are here dancing with King Charles or whether you're here commemorating Holocaust Memorial Day, it's an honour and a privilege. The theme of Holocaust Memorial Day this year is ordinary people, but you are extraordinary people to us, and we absolutely love you. We wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom and a peaceful weekend. Thank you for joining us.